Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, first part now for the 9th of February 2025. Sorry, my brain doesn't really work today and I'm many hours late with this because I am incredibly not well at the moment. I can't do my walking either at the moment. It's all, whatever, you don't need to know. The other thing is, well done England yesterday, giving one over Les Bleus. That was something delightful to watch. So, thank goodness for small mercies. Okay, let's start with the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply, of course, and you can find those caveats in the description below. Here we have 1,460 personnel lost, which is a pretty high number, up from the previous couple of days. 11 tanks, just a snip above the daily average. 20 troop carrying AFVs on the daily average, and 24 artillery systems a tad above daily average. There we have 127 vehicles and fuel tanks, very high number lost in that category, and one piece of special equipment, and most notably an aircraft as well. So they have lost an aircraft. We'll come to that in a second. No Andrew Perpetual loss list today, but quite a few little tidbits to get into to see if we can understand these figures more thoroughly and get a sense of their potential accuracy. Okay, first of all, Russia lost more troops near Pokrovsk in a month than in the entire Second Chechen War, according to the spokesman for the Khortysia Regional State Administration. Russia had 7,000 plus irreversible losses in January alone, exceeding the 6,000 officially declared in Chechnya, and that's without storming the city. This is good news for the Ukrainians that they have actually slowed the Russian attacks down there. Indeed, there are claims that the intensity of the Russian attacks has gone down, partly, one assumes, because they are running low on troops and equipment. The Ukrainians have really been under the cosh in Pokrovsk. So let's just dip into Pokrovsk a little bit. This is Georgy Revishvili saying a very interesting update on the Pokrovsk direction. Oleksiy Herman, chief of the electronic warfare unit at the 111th Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, shares details about the situation. Indeed, the intensity of Russian assaults has dropped significantly. So that's what I just said first thing there. This is due to the enemy's heavy losses and, as I understand it, their difficulties with replenishment. We must also understand that everything they pass through, cities and logistics, has been destroyed. Remember Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, New York, Toretsk, there's no infrastructure left. Second, it's winter now, and there's about a 3-kilometer grey zone between our positions and theirs. With modern technology, we can instantly detect any movement there. The moment we spot activity, a drone is deployed, eliminating enemy personnel before they even reach the positions. Is there a chance that Pokrovsk can be held? Well, there was the fortress of Bakhmut, which we went through, then Chasiv Yar, and then New York. Now, Pokrovsk has become a fortress. The front line before Pokrovsk was, and Minograd is fully stabilized. The enemy has been stopped there. They will try to bypass it from the flanks, from the right and left, in an attempt to capture at least one Ukrainian city intact, but that's unlikely to succeed. How events will unfold remains to be seen. If reinforcements, ammunition, and everything needed for war, especially personnel to cover medical losses, arrive, then the enemy has no chance. They are completely disorganized and demoralized. Even interrogating prisoners is no longer interesting. It's always the same story. Demoralization is evident, with little will to fight. Occasionally, some reckless ones appear, and we try to sport and to eliminate them quickly. We're facing an army with different regiments, and their effectiveness depends on leadership. I've seen those who, fearing retreat, push forward no matter what. This is driven by the harshness of their commanders, the conditions in the rear, and the rigidity of their orders. On the impact of Mikhailo Tripati's appointment as commander of the Khortysia OSG, it will take him at least a month and a half to assess everything, the strong and weak brigades, available resources, and what the state can provide. He'll also need to determine whether the commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, will assign an offensive or defensive mission, and with which forces and assets. I don't believe in miracle generals. I believe in the soldier on the front lines and his commander. Everything is built from the ground up through morale, psychological work, and their soldier's spirit. That's what holds everything together. So there's a new commander in that Pokrovsk area, it appears, and there might be some changes, but it has been tough for the Russians, it appears, as they have incurred incredible losses there, and they are struggling to continue the momentum. and replenish those losses. Now, the 12th Special Operations Brigade Azov wiped out Russians on a suicide mission in civilian cars. After initially hitting the cars itself, the remaining infantrymen scattered in the fields, but were finished off with FPV drones. This is another example, yet again, of unarmored vehicles being used in attacks and getting taken out. 47th Brigade and allies repel a massive Russian infantry assault, now with North Korean troops. Unlike previous armoured pushes, this attack relied on waves of infantry for 16 plus hours. At least a company of Russian forces was wiped out. So, looking at all of this evidence, I think we can probably safely assume that the Russians are really struggling for equipment. I don't think there's any other way of understanding all of these data points. Now, Jakub Janovsky talks about this. He says, I'm not sure how to reconcile the fact that Russia should still have a huge number of AFVs. So when you look at all the deep storage bases back in Russia, and you're thinking, even some of the most sort of maybe charitable analyses say, the harshest analyses will say that, they've got enough till sort of September time, halfway through this year. That's when the excrement hits the fan. But actually, I don't know that we're not already there, or at least in many areas of the front line, it appears that they are struggling to get that equipment. So Jakub Janovsky from Oryx here saying, well, I can't reconcile this idea that they're supposed to have a bunch more equipment still, and they're producing this much a month supposedly. They have these deep storage bases that still have some of these units, and yet we are seeing repeatedly unarmored convoys being used in attacks. So he says, I can't reconcile the fact that Russia should still have a huge number of AFVs with such an insane use of civilian vehicles for assault in high-intensity conventional war. And he's referring here to yesterday's thread from Special Kherson Cat, or not thread, post here. Less than half a year ago, they say, to say that the Russians went to attack the frontline positions exhaustively in a column of civilian vehicles would have been met with a huge dose of distrust. Now it is a routine that no longer surprises anyone. They really are using and losing a lot of these civilian vehicles. And then you go back to this data point and you see 127 vehicles and fuel tanks lost. Then you are beginning to think that, we continue to think that the Russians really are struggling for combat asset equipment. So remember, my job here is to try and get an accurate sense of what's going on for both sides. It's very difficult to know what's going on with the Ukrainians because we just don't have as much data coming out. The Ukrainians are very careful with their OPSEC, and they don't really publish stats in the way that we do from the Russian side. The stats we get are really from Andrew Perpetua, who looks at the socials and counts up, and it just, the Russians are losing massive amounts of stuff and have done all through the war, right from the very beginning. But as we can see from the stats that the General Staff released, that I think are supported by Andrew Perpetua's analyses and to some degree Oryx, although I think Andrew Perpetua does a more robust job. We can see that if we look at vehicles and fuel tanks, for example, and if I get rid of my head here, then you should be able to see that, we are just seeing huge numbers of vehicles and fuel tanks being lost. That gradient gets steeper. As it gets steeper, it indicates that they're losing more and more. Compare it to a couple of years ago, and the numbers are just fundamentally different. When you look at APVs, you see here that actually they're dropping down. That dotted orange line indicates that there is a trend going downwards in APVs as that gradient becomes shallower here. It was steep in this area. That was after the counteroffensive of the Ukrainians when the Russians then attacked in Avdiivka, and they were attacking at that time. If you remember, there were like convoys of 30 to 60 vehicles they were using, and they were getting obliterated. So you had some of these huge, like 120 APVs, like that's armored personnel vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, MRAPs and whatnot, being lost in a single day. Absolutely phenomenal. Would you see that now? Unlikely not, because they just don't have them. They're losing fewer vehicles here. If we go and look at tanks, I'm sure it would be a fairly similar situation indeed. There we go. So dipping down, although over the last few, maybe a couple of weeks, it's dipped up a little bit again, but not at the levels that we were seeing here, when some days you have 55 tanks were claimed to be lost. Now, obviously, general staff, caveats, etc., but even if you take, I don't know, 15% off these stats or whatever, you still get an idea of the trend. Let's assume that if they are inaccurate to some degree, they're inaccurate consistently, right? So the trends are still indicative. Artillery, I guess, is less useful to look at here, but still, a huge drop recently, coming back up again of late. But yeah. Right, let's go back to look at some of these data sources again. What do we have here? Well, this is introducing the population of Russian turtles. Right, so now we're talking about these vehicles that are part of the category of troop-carrying AFVs and sometimes tanks. So in these two categories, but they are ones that have been adapted Mad Max style. And they are, and we've talked about, what the reason is that they'll be used in this kind of way, and what this says about the lack of ability to repair maybe the tanks. So the tanks are then used as APCs. Maybe they don't want to lose a vehicle for a month or two, sending it back to be repaired if the turret's broken. So they just whack a bunch of iron on top and use it as a glorified APC? Or is it the fact that tanks just aren't very useful? They don't really want that to be used as a tank. They'd much rather use it as an APC to deliver troops from A to B. But anyway, there are a lot of these, what here Special Kherson Cat calls turtles. 2 tanks in this video, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 2 APCs, and an armoured recovery vehicle in turtle modifications destroyed by the forces of State Border Guard Service of Ukraine. Also, for burning through the shell of a disabled turtles, drones with thermite are again well used. Fascinating. So we see that at one point where a drone lands on it. I think it doesn't drop thermite from above. It lands on it and just releases thermite from in situ. I think it might be this one there. Yeah, it just lands on it, and then that thermite just starts boiling through the top there. There you go. And it goes through the top. So yeah, different ways of taking out these. What you can see here is the accuracy. If you look at this video, the accuracy of the drone pilots, there was another video that came out yesterday or the day before talking about how, anti-drone nets or coat cages aren't so useful because I think they are useful, but drone pilots are learning to get under and get around and find the weak spots on these vehicles. It's a game of cat and mouse, isn't it, always? Okay, what else? I have a Strela 10 here, a short-range air defense system that's taken out with a couple of FPV drones. So that's another fairly important piece of equipment taken out. I do wonder what the air defense coverage is for the Russians these days. I wonder whether the Ukrainians can afford to get a little bit risky with getting airframes closer to the contact line. The Russians over time probably might be worth going back to Dell's stats here. Oh, my face isn't back on, so lucky you guys. Anti-aircraft systems, we have fairly consistent throughout this period. You can see the orange there, but a purple patch for the Ukrainians around the time of so that's May 2023. If you remember, that's the Ukrainian counteroffensive. They got stuck initially and then said, right, we need to take out air defense and artillery, and they worked really hard at tricking the Russian air defenses and artillery. But then of late, you can see that the general trend has been downward. The frequency of these orange bars has gone down. In other words, they were taking out air defense systems most days around this time period, and now it's every few days you might see an air defense piece taken out. Okay, this is a very rare number there. That might have been a readjustment rather than actually taking 13 out in a single day. It could be that they found out some new data from previously, but the point being that generally speaking, there are fewer air defense systems being taken out, and my theory would be that probably represents that there are fewer of them to take out, so indicating that the Ukrainians have done a good job of attriting them. And if that's the case, might we see the Ukrainians push the envelope a little bit with their use of aircraft? Okay, Now going on to, I mentioned this yesterday, I think in the military aid video. This was the airstrike on a Russian underground bunker of the 35th Russian Brigade in Seladove that apparently took out some really high level, or took out the entire command of the 35th Russian Brigade. As stated in the source associated with the Ukrainian military aviation, the strike was carried out with the help of 2,000-pound, 900-kilogram bombs, which is pretty good to see the Ukrainians using these big old bombs. If so, it'd be the first publicly known use of that. Several days ago, it became known that the 1,000-pound JDAM-ER, so the American-provided guided glide bombs, also actively used by Ukrainian aviation when the video of an airstrike by Ukrainian Su-27 was released. The airstrike on the Russian underground bunker of the 35th Brigade, a photo from the ground, the first to report about the attack and the headquarters of the 35th were the Russians themselves yesterday. Only they assumed that the attack was carried out with the help of HIMARS, but it's far more substantial than HIMARS. So anyway, good to see the Ukrainians using these guided glide bombs. And then the reason I put that there is, the talking about the air defense being attrited. Might we see the Ukrainian Air Force get a little bit closer to the line? Might we see more usage of guided glide bombs? Well, 2 and 2 could equal 4 there at the moment. Okay. And then we move on to this aircraft that the Ukrainians shot down. So we heard rumors initially that Russian fighter had been shot down. We now know it definitely did get shot down because it's on camera. It was taken out with an Igla MANPADS, man-portable air defense system. Ukrainian armed forces reported destruction of the Russian Su-25 attack aircraft near Toretsk. And then a Mi-8 helicopter came to try and rescue the pilot. So there's that plane as it went down. Helicopter Mi-8 came around to rescue the pilot, then got attacked by first-person view drones, which is fascinating. So we know that drones have had some success previously with taking out helicopters or certainly damaging them. And then that's what's happened. That's what happened here. Helicopter limped apparently back home. It was damaged, but it wasn't taken down. So also the Mi-8. So it's claimed that the plane was shot down by fire from MANPADS. Pilot allegedly managed to eject. Writes the Z Channel military informant. The Mi-8 helicopter tried to evacuate the pilot, but the FPV crews did not allow him to do so. As a result, the helicopter limped back to and was in need of repairs, the brigade said in a statement. So there's an FPV drone coming to try and take out the helicopter. So it'd be a dangerous job, wouldn't it? You wouldn't fancy your chances doing that mission without, everything's about drones these days, and that's pretty much around the contact line, very close to the contact line. There you've got drones trying to attack it when it was on the ground, and also just flying very close there. So 3 drones getting close. Whether it had electronic warfare on and those drones didn't succeed, I don't know, but the claim is that it limped back to base. Okay, then we have this. Russia has suffered so many losses to FPV drones in Donetsk, so very close to where that plane was lost, but further north in the Chasiv Yar area, that they've created a 2-kilometer net tunnel in one particularly hot part of the front line. The road from Chasiv Yar to Bakhmut, a vital supply route for the invaders, is now protected. Interesting here, and again, this is a cat and mouse game, needs must. The Russians adapting by essentially creating a chicken wire tunnel for 2 kilometers of road. And, fair enough. I presume they needed it and they've done a job with that. I wonder whether flying along with a thermite drone might just put an end to that. Dropping thermite along that 2 kilometers might then render that they need to make that again. Would be my opinion. So I get the old thermite drones going there, but interesting that the Russians are doing that. Not to be laughed at is my opinion. When you see some of these things, it is one showing that Ukrainians in this case are doing an amazing job of taking out equipment with drones. But 2, if this stops drones from being as effective, then jobs are good and for the Russians there. And finally, in this section, I talked to you yesterday about a commander that was assassinated. Just a bit more detail on that. As a checker OGPU Telegram channel found out, the battery commander of the division of the 112th Guards Missile Brigade. So this is a guy that was responsible, Negaiko, for taking out, was it Hrovo in Kharkiv? Hroza in Kharkiv, where there was a funeral and there were people gathered at a wake, I think in a tea room there, and a missile struck and it killed like 59 people. So he is responsible for that and is not very popular, as you can imagine. He was blown up in the Ivanovo region, and now we know, or at least the claim is, it was a bomb placed in a parcel. So main intelligence director at the MOD of Ukraine reported the death of Nagayko as a result of an explosion that occurred on the 3rd. According to Ukrainian Special Services, the officer was involved in that attack that killed 59 people. So tiny bit more detail there. Right, moving on to distant strikes. Not too much really known at the moment. A massive strike, a set of drones flown into Ukrainian airspace last night. 150 were launched. I think, one of the biggest nights of drone attacks. 7 got past the defense. Let's have a look at the drones, shall we? Because I think we are seeing at the moment just huge numbers. Yeah, like they've really ticked up, haven't they? So, sorry that my face is in the way. Let's get it out of the way. There you go. So you can now see that trend lines are going up. The steepness of this gradient is increased. As you can see, huge waves being sent really consistently. And sometimes they have better success of getting drones through than on other days. 7 last night. It's not bad interception rate because actually a fully 150 were sent. 70 shot down, 74 were electronic warfare or decoys. I don't know of any strikes successful Russian targeting there. I know that Nikopol on the Zaporizhia reservoir has been heavily shelled again. Russia, on the other hand, says it stopped 35 drones fired by the Ukrainians overnight. More than half of them were said to have been shot down in Kursk region, while 7 other regions, including Crimea, were also targeted. And the Russians closed St. Petersburg airport. So I don't know if Tim White's got any extra info on successful strikes. Yeah, there's Nikopol. You can see he's been struck. Normal kind of civilian infrastructure being hit there. What we are hearing about are some strikes that took place, as I always say, these details emerge. So last night, maybe the details of the Ukrainian strikes might emerge over the next few days, over the next week, in the same way that we are seeing here. Storm Shadow strike on January the 26th, so that's now a couple of weeks ago, hit an underground bunker storing Russian attack drones in Oriol region. Satellite images confirm the aftermath of the strike. Apparently over 200 Shahed drones were taken out in that strike, is the claim. And now there's satellite imagery to support that claim. Although, as Noel reports then goes on to say, seems like Russia has created multiple storage facilities in that place. So there might need to be a bit of a revisit sometime soon from Ukrainian munitions. And then we hear of the Albashneft refinery that was hit. When was that hit? On the 5th of February. So we're now on the 9th, so that's sort of 4 days ago. A tank at the Albashneft refinery was completely burned in the attack, and another tank sustained damage. Satellite images from the Svoboda report. One tank reportedly contained 60,000 tons of diesel fuel. So it's a key mini refinery supplying fuel to the Russian army. And a book system was also hit on that night in Zaporizhia. So that was a claim from 4 days ago, and now there's evidence to support that. Okay, now on to other bits and pieces. First of all, according to Russian channels, Ukrainian forces launched a counter-offensive pushing Russian troops out of Kotlina. Attacks also ongoing on the Pischani with mechanized units and infantry backed by a swarm of FPV drones and 155mm artillery. I'm probably going to have to do, not probably, I am going to have to do a mapping update today if I can sort of motivate myself to do so. And this is not the Pischani up north. I think this is, so this is Kotlina here, which is by Pokrovsk. Now, Andrew Perpetua the other day talked about how there were 3 attacks that the Ukrainians were mounting against the Russians. One was here in Kamyanska, where the Ukrainians are pushing down and are having some success pushing the Russians back there. There was one, obviously you've got Kursk as well, and then one here where the Ukrainians are pushing back in the Pischani area there. Remember, there's another, what I call the Pischani sector up here. That's not what we're talking about. So the Russians having some success there and success up here, where they're pushing across the Oskil River. But if we come further south here, it's interesting that the Ukrainians are pushing back in Pischani and might well have retaken Kotlina. And that's what's being said here. According to Russian channels, so Russians saying this, Ukrainian forces launched a counteroffensive, pushing Russian troops out of Kotlina. Attacks are also ongoing in Pischani, with mechanized units and infantry backed by a swarm of FPV drones and 155mm artillery. So it looks like the Ukrainians are pushing back a little bit in the Pokrovsk area, and I refer you back to the thread earlier in this video. Now, CryptoWiki has another thread here. The Russian army is reportedly forcing mobilized soldiers to either sign permanent contracts or be sent to die in assaults. The reasons are unclear, but it may be intended to prevent them demobilizing if a ceasefire deal is reached. The Russian pro-war philologist in Ambush Telegram channel reports that the ultimatum has been issued by the Dnipro Group of Forces in the Southern Military District. Commanders and political officers have been ordered to persuade their men with threats. The channel says that the order has gone out to organise agitation among servicemen called up by the mobilisation with the aim of increasing the staffing of formations and military units with servicemen serving under contract. It speculates that the intention is to ensure that they stay in the army after demobilisation is announced, so that Russia's combat capabilities do not suddenly collapse. Notably, the neo-Nazi mercenary group Rusisch recently issued a similar warning of collapse. The philologist writes, quote, "As far as I can see, the contracting of mobilised servicemen is unlikely to ensure the maintenance of the total number of the active contingent, since the mobilised are already part of it. Other carrot and stick mechanisms are at work for this purpose. The first thing that comes to mind is raising the overall reporting figures for contract soldiers, i.e. juggling with figures and statistical dust in the eyes. Everything is going well and according to plan. The army is replenished with contract soldiers. There is no shortage of personnel, not like the Ukrainians who are being forced onto buses." Now, you can take this with in tandem with the other claim, and there's another claim. I don't think I've got a thread for you on it, or just one that references a little bit. There are claims that the Russians command are taking bonuses for taking towns and villages, and that's why they're claiming to take towns and villages, and actually they're not often doing that. And then that, as we know, that's then forcing them to throw these meat assaults at villages to actually prove that they've got them when they've been called out for it. Anyway, quote, "Further, it is possible to save money on the allowances of contract soldiers, unlike mobilised soldiers. Here, for example," writes a comrade, quote, "Now I was talking to a fellow soldier, a mobilised man who is standing on the border. A telegram came to their unit that all mobilised persons must be behind the tape front line, otherwise there is a corruption component in it. It turns out that the MOD started counting federal payments to the mobilised. In addition to this, the contractorisation of mobilised people formally reduces the social basis for domestic tension. In fact, however, the tension itself does not go away, since contracts that have no expiration date are simply another form of enslavement, but formally the official structures have something to answer with. Here are the signed contracts. What claims can they have against us? Whether these contracts were signed voluntarily or under compulsion is not important for formal justification, and the facts of coercion still must be proved." So on and so forth. Lots more can be said about that. But yeah, basically, they are worried about demobilization and the collapse of the Russian armed forces if a ceasefire was called. And of course, that would then give the Ukrainians possibly the idea that they could maybe stop the ceasefire and go and attack themselves. Now, Russian soldiers from the 810th Sevastopol Marine Brigade, this is one that's been absolutely hammered up in Kursk, complain about terrible conditions. Quote, "We live like homeless, haven't washed in almost a month, sitting here like rats. They've been without rotation for a month, constantly under fire with an ATGM next to the trench." So there's another video. I mean, that is again first-hand evidence from the Russians that conditions are really, really poor. Now, what else do we have? No, that's not supposed to be there. North Korea has sent, and I'm deeply worried about this because North Korean soldiers being sent to the Kursk front line allows the Russians to continue to do what they're doing, like continue the war, stretch out the war for longer, allows them not to take forces away from places like Pokrovsk, which then allows them to continue to take territory in Pokrovsk. So I think people who underplay the impact of the North Koreans are unwise to do so. And now it looks like North Koreans are helping Russia not just militarily, but economically. This is very, very annoying because actually I think Russia are on a precipice, and this is evidence that they are on a precipice. They wouldn't be doing this if they didn't have to. They have to do this. North Korea has sent thousands of workers to Russia, and it's done that last year, violating a UN resolution as per Yonhap, South Korean agency. They reportedly filled labour shortages at Russian construction sites. Pyongyang and Moscow are suspected of using student visas to bypass the ban. Again, UN resolution, what's the UN doing about this? Is this being investigated? Do the UN have any teeth at all? North Korea, as Tim White says, has sent thousands of workers to Russia to help with the Kremlin's self-created manpower crisis. Who cares it's in violation of the UN sanctions? This is reported by South Korean intelligence. Yonhap is actually an intelligence agency, I think. The new axis of evil also agreed for North Korea to build a drone factory to supply Russia, which is something I reported on yesterday. I think this is a massive challenge and something needs to be done about it. And despite significant losses of North Korean troops in the Kursk region, particularly Kim Jong-un has vowed to continue supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine. North Korea has provided approximately 11,000 soldiers and missile technology used in attacks on Ukraine, says War Translated. But he's come out publicly and said he will continue to support Russia for as long as it takes, type thing. Now, Trump has admitted he's talked to Putin already, but won't say how many times. He added he'd better not say how many times. Make of that what you will, says Tim White. The rest of the interview with the US president was the usual nonsense, ignoring how he did nothing to stop it during his previous tenure. Okay. Just one thing I want to say about peace negotiations that I think is we often talk in this section about peace negotiations. One issue I have is that if you ask me to go and do peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, my opinion is that Putin is a murderous bastard. He's a dictator. He's evil, and Ukraine are the good guys. And if I was mediating negotiations, I would be fighting really hard for Ukraine to get what they deserve in terms of a just peace. And that morally and politically, I would be on Ukraine's side. What I really, really worry about is that we have already heard how in 2018, how Trump preferred Putin over his own intelligence agencies, that he sees Putin as a strong man. He's never said anything negative about Putin. So when he picks up the phone and speaks to Putin, if I was to pick up the phone and speak to Putin, I'd be like, yeah, you're a bastard. So I my whole frame of the whole manner in which I'd conduct that conversation would be within that framework, right? Now, you could argue that Trump is in a much better position because he likes Putin and he's going to be on his side and therefore can, use that. But the thing is, he doesn't feel strongly about Ukraine needing a just peace. He keeps saying, listen to his words, he keeps saying, we want this war to stop immediately. Too many people are dying. And then he talks rubbish about how many people have died and how many buildings are destroyed and golden domed churches, whatever. But the reality is he's not fighting for justice for Ukraine. If he was and was mated with Putin, then actually that would be quite a useful mechanism to get good objectives achieved. But here he doesn't care for Ukraine, and he quite likes Putin. And that means that any call with Putin, I think, is going to be thoroughly problematic. It's just, he's going to pick up the phone and speak to Putin, and Putin's going to know that he can manipulate Trump. And this is not to the benefit of Ukraine. It just simply isn't. So I do worry about that. Now, International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim Khan, who oversaw the court's arrest warrant for Russian President Putin in March 2023 over Moscow's deportation of Ukrainian children. So remember, Putin has an ICC arrest warrant over his head. He's been named, that court prosecutor has been named in the US's, as of now, non-public economic and travel sanction list, according to Reuters. So the ICC is being targeted by the Trump administration for being harsh about Netanyahu. And now the US is trying to get sort of retribution on the ICC. But unfortunately, that is retribution on people that have done a really good job in attacking Putin. So again, Putin's laughing all the way all the way to, I mean, this is like Christmas come late for Putin. It's just insane. Right, we've got some ship issues. A municipal emergency has been declared in Novelsky district of Sakhalin, so it's a Russian region, due to a Chinese fuel tanker running aground. I have some reports that it's coal, but I don't know. Anyway, if that is oil, then that's really problematic. The seas just keep getting absolutely hammered by these ships, and it's not cool. And then we hear that Koala oil tanker is sinking in the Ust-Luga seaport. So this is St. Petersburg. According to the Russian Telegram channels, it's carrying 130,000 tons of mazout. So this is oil, the sort that we have seen in Crimea, which is continuing. I haven't reported it, but it is continuing to give issues in the Black Sea. But here now, apparently the vessel is registered in Antigua and Barbuda. Reportedly, it was ready to leave the port when 3 explosions sounded in the engine room. I don't know if that's sabotage or what, but yeah, authorities say there is no oil leak risk and the ship has been cordoned off. Earlier today, on the opposite end of Russia and Sakhalin, that's the one, a Chinese oil tanker carrying diesel, mazout and coal. Right, so it's got all 3, diesel, mazout and coal, ran aground. Russia's fuel trade is an environmental time bomb in more ways than one. That's really, really bad news for the environment and challenging for the Russians for sure. Then, talking about naval activity, Russian Rostelecom reported damage to its underwater cable in the Baltic Sea due to, quote, external influence. Meanwhile, 2 other Russian cables in the Gulf of Finland are also undergoing repairs. Looks like the game can be played on both sides, says War Translated. So I wonder if sabotage has been committed against Russian cables, and if so, by whom? And finally, let's finish on a positive here. So this is I'm quite a fan of Prince Harry. I think of all the royal family in the UK, he's the one I'd most like to go to the pub with by country mile. Absolutely, he seems like a decent human being. Anyway, he started the Invictus Games, which is like the Olympic Games for those soldiers, armed forces personnel who have been injured and who are disabled. It's a fantastic thing that he's done here. He gave the speech at the start of the games and then took himself to the Ukrainian team to go and give them some love. And I love that. So let's have some positivity.
Invictus, never stop fighting until all you
I just think that's really positive. Ukraine have their biggest team. As you can imagine, they're going to have more disabled people now than they've ever had, considering they've had 3 years of war. So they hopefully will put in a good show at that event. And it's really good to see Harry giving extra props to the Ukrainians there, which is, I think a good indication of his moral fibre. So good stuff. Anyway, end on a positive. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.